According to the butterfly effect, humanity's fate can be altered by a single choice. In other words, it's a complete mess, at least for the protagonist. Up until now, he has made several life decisions that he deeply regrets. Someone on the other side of the door calls out to him, asking if he's listening. The person insists that they know he's inside and demands that he open the door. They reveal that they've already spoken to the House of Masters and confirmed that he has no classes today. The knocking grows more persistent as the protagonist mutters to himself that there's no stalker worse than this one. Suddenly, the voice outside declares that it's fine. If he won't open the door, they'll simply force their way in. A knife stabs through the door, and a chilling voice announces their intention to break in. Naturally, the protagonist panics at the thought of this lunatic actually cutting through the door. The sound of the door being sliced apart fills the air as the so-called intruder comments that, unfortunately for him, she happens to be the student council president. She steps into the room, questioning why he constantly keeps exactly 32 meters between them, leaving the protagonist horrified that she's actually keeping track of such a precise distance. The girl has silver hair, a charming little hat, and a striking red mouth, exuding an eerie but captivating aura. She asks when he plans to marry her. However, before he can react, another voice interrupts from the window, questioning what nonsense the princess is talking about. A girl with cat ears perches on the sill, watching the scene with clear amusement. The protagonist immediately recognizes her as Sarah's, while the princess complains that the room is too bright for an assassin to be lurking in. She warns Sarah's to leave since she doesn't want witnesses to what is about to happen. Sarah's playfully sticks out her tongue, pointing out that eliminating witnesses is part of her job as an assassin. Meanwhile, the protagonist, utterly overwhelmed, internally protests that he never agreed to any of this. He hasn't even thought about marriage, so why are they discussing it? Before he can make sense of the situation, the ceiling suddenly collapses as yet another intruder arrives. This new girl, adorned with tribal tattoos on her thighs, declares that it's time for the protagonist to start living with her. She confidently states that all the wedding preparations have been made, and now all that's left is for him to go with her. Before he can react, yet another arrival crashes into the room, wielding a chain like a whip. A black-haired woman coldly questions how he constantly finds himself surrounded by so many snobs. The chaos escalates as a demonic-looking witch appears, sneering at the scene before her. With an air of superiority, she claims that the protagonist has belonged to her for a long time. Her name is Fine. Tension fills the room as the women begin bickering, each one claiming their right over him. Insults are exchanged, accusations are hurled, and it's clear that none of them intend to back down. With their emotions boiling over, the confrontation quickly turns into an all-out battle, leaving the protagonist trapped helplessly in the middle. The real question is, how did things end up like this? As the chaos unfolds around him, memories begin to flood his mind, taking him back to the moment Eleanor first proposed marriage to him. That was the beginning of everything. Everything traces back to a survival game, Savior's Ascension. From an outside perspective, anyone looking at this game for the first time would probably call it a complete mess. However, the protagonist had played through it before, completed it, and even enjoyed the ending. It had been a fun experience, one he thought was worth it. But then, for reasons he couldn't comprehend, he was suddenly transported into the game itself. Unlike the typical scenarios in stories like these, he had no particular attachment to the game, no grudge against the developers, and no strong feelings about the protagonist. Yet, somehow, he found himself inhabiting the body of Dade Campbell, the heir of a minor viscount from an isolated third-rate town. His family's land was nothing more than fields of crops, lacking any prestige or significance in the world's political landscape. In fact, in the grand scheme of the game's story, his family was barely even mentioned, and yet, for some reason, the moment the Viscount's son entered Elin Academy, the entire world was turned upside down. Standing at the gates of his home, Dade bids farewell to his father, who watches him with misty eyes, proud that his son has been accepted into such a prestigious institution. He warns Dade to avoid trouble and be careful, as Elin Academy is filled with high-ranking nobles. All he wants is for his son to blend in and not stand out. Dade, fully aware of the dangers ahead, solemnly swears that he will do his absolute best not to attract any attention. At this moment, Dade Campbell's status is at absolute zero. No skills, no mastery, no talents. Even as a seasoned player who has read countless stories, he feels a chill down his spine realizing just how weak his character truly is. His primary mission is to enroll in the academy and be placed in a class. He understands that ignoring the game's missions is a guaranteed death sentence. On top of that, Elan Academy is on the verge of descending into chaos due to increasing civilian violence. But Dade has no intention of doing anything that would put his survival at risk. Determined, he assures his father that he will not draw attention to himself. He refuses to even entertain the thought of trying to improve his family's reputation. His father seems taken aback by how serious Dade is about staying under the radar. Dade even plans to keep his grades below average, ensuring that no one pays him any mind. His father, confused but supportive, tells him to just do his best as Dade boards the train heading to Eland Academy. He reflects on his plan. He intends to keep a low profile, remaining unnoticed just as he had been his entire life. Solitude has always been his reality, and it will remain so at the academy. However, fate has other plans. Despite his efforts to stay out of the spotlight, he ends up sharing a carriage with one of the most dangerous individuals in the entire world, Eleanor the Bloodthirsty. Even at her young age, she had already amassed a mountain of corpses beneath her feet. In the game, she was the final boss, growing stronger and more ruthless with every passing scenario. As her sanity dwindled, the dormant existence of the Grey Demon would consume her, transforming her into an unstoppable force of destruction. Yet, right now, Eleanor appears healthy, composed, and strangely kind. As Dade sits in silence, processing her unexpected demeanor, she suddenly asks if he needs medical attention. She notes that his face looks pale, almost sickly. Dade stiffens, barely managing to stammer out a response. Eleanor apologizes for the sudden intrusion and explains that her kingdom seeks to present a friendly image. As a result, she was deliberately placed in the same carriage as him to symbolize their willingness to integrate with others. As she speaks, Dade finds himself puzzled. The Eleanor in front of him is nothing like what he remembers from the game. In the game, she was described as a perfectionist, an elitist, and utterly ruthless. So why does she seem soft-spoken? Eleanor notices his silence and asks if he has any questions. Struggling to form an answer, Dade clumsily says that he's just surprised by how kind she is. Eleanor's eyes narrow. She wants to know if someone has been spreading rumors about her. Before Dade can dig his grave any deeper, an object crashes through the window, hurtling straight toward his head. Instinctively, he throws himself toward Eleanor, shielding her from the impact. In an instant, the train explodes. As the chaos unfolds, Dade clings to Eleanor, fully aware that her protective amulet will shield him as well. And so, despite all his careful planning to avoid attention, he just became the center of an entirely different kind of disaster. Nor naturally assumed that he had tried to save her, declaring that she had never met a man as genuinely honest as him. She thanked him for his intentions, reassuring him that there was no need to apologize. Meanwhile, Dud stood there, awkwardly frozen, not because he had heroically saved her, but because he had thrown himself at her purely for self-preservation, knowing that her armor would absorb the impact. Unfortunately for him, she had completely misinterpreted his actions. As she stood up, she fixed her gaze on him, demanding to know his name, and that's when Dud realized he was screwed. If he told her his name every time they met from now on, they would inevitably interact. It was best to avoid that, but at the same time, he knew that trying to deceive someone as sharp as her was impossible, so he hesitated, then finally sighed before answering. De Campbell. What a moron. The damn woman smiled, promising she would never forget it and that she would repay this favor someday. At that moment, he unlocked the interest of a noble, triggering the special event conditions. His rewards arrived immediately. Desperate Survivor, a skill that increased his stats the closer he was to death. Deadly Charm, a passive ability that made villains more likely to be attracted to him. While later, several carriages approached the wreckage of the explosion. There, passengers demanding answers. How could a train headed to Ulfin be completely destroyed? Fortunately, the medical teams had arrived quickly, keeping casualties to a minimum. The injured were treated and then transferred straight to the academy. Sometime later, on the road, Dud sat alone, staring at his newly acquired gifts. What the hell am I supposed to do with these? There it was, his destined attraction, or rather, mortal charm, as it had been translated. Essentially, it meant that his talent forced malicious individuals to take an interest in him. And when that happened, he would receive rewards in return. Now it all made sense. Since arriving, there had been no way to determine his special talent. Everyone in Campbellstown was friendly, so his ability had never been activated. But now it was clear this was his innate talent. It was because he had caught Eleanor's attention that he received Desperate Survivor, a skill that increased his attributes in proportion to how close he was to death. In addition to that, Mortal Charm made it easier for dangerous individuals to develop an interest in him. And the more extreme the situation, the stronger its effects would be. Desperate Survivor seemed like the perfect skill for combat survival. However, Mortal Charm was far from ideal. He already knew exactly which people in this academy could be considered the most dangerous. And unfortunately, all of them were potential threats to him. A knight obsessed with battle, a sword goddess who cuts down anyone within 3 steps of her, a violent assassin who kills as long as the price is right, and a genius mage who exposes everything without a shred of concern. Every single one of them was incredibly difficult to deal with. However, he needed to remember that gaining skills was his priority for survival. Something was strange, though. His talent ranking was listed as, instead of an actual grade. That meant it was either incredible or completely worthless. A medic standing nearby noticed him muttering to himself and asked if he was all right. But before he could answer, the academy gates came into view. Inside, the entrance ceremony was taking place. One of those boring speeches welcoming the new students was underway. However, Dade's mind was still fixated on the conversation he had earlier with the carriage driver. The man had asked him if he had really been in the same train as Princess Eleanor. And when Dade confirmed it, the driver gave him a serious warning. As someone from an unknown family, he needed to understand that it was no coincidence that the rock hit exactly where he and Eleanor were seated. The Tristan family had many enemies, and if Dade stayed too close to her, he would become a target as well. Dade casually responded that he would keep that in mind, but deep down, he already knew it wouldn't matter. The system had already confirmed that another event would involve her, and if he ignored system events, he would die. He had no real choice in the matter. Besides, defamation was common in this academy. It was no wonder Eleanor eventually became the final boss. A group of 3 nobles suddenly approached, looking down on him. They sneered, wondering what an idiot like him was thinking. Clearly, a peasant from the countryside had gotten lost in such a grand place. Meanwhile, the first dual pairing test was beginning. As expected, the students were forming pairs for training, and Dade had no one left to choose from. That meant he was stuck with whoever was left. And if someone hadn't been picked yet, it probably meant they were insanely strong. Unfortunately for him, that was exactly the case. His partner was Elia Christianax, the strongest genius in this world. She greeted him with a cheerful smile, asking if he needed a helping hand. He reluctantly nodded, already knowing his fate. Elia wasn't just powerful, she was the protagonist of the Savior's Ascension storyline. Her outstretched hand seemed friendly, but he knew better. Meanwhile, in another room, a bespectacled woman was discussing the arrival of Count Kitten and Gallon with another official, frustrated. She wondered how Eleanor could possibly be late for something as important as the entrance duels. At that moment, Eleanor entered the room, covered in blood, yet looking completely unfazed. The bespectacled woman sighed, demanding to know where she had been. Eleanor casually responded that she had some business to take care of. Unimpressed, the woman dismissed everyone else, preparing to have a private conversation with Eleanor. Once they were alone, she coldly asked how many people had died. Eleanor nonchalantly replied that only about 12 had tried to kill her and failed. Apparently, even after the train attack, they were bold enough to strike again. The bespectacled woman scolded her, saying she should have let the academy handle it, but Eleanor dismissed the idea outright, calling it tedious. Why would she let others kill her attackers when she could do it herself? The headmistress sighed and instructed Eleanor to get changed and prepare for her duel if she hurried. She might even get to watch Elia Christianax fight against some no-name peasant called Dade Campbell. Eleanor paused. She had no idea who that was. However, as she laughed softly, she noted that he seemed different. Back in the arena, Dade stood trembling as the crowd mocked him, calling him a country bumpkin. He knew his stats were garbage. If he took one hit, he was dead. But in theory, his desperate survivor talent should kick in and boost his stats when facing danger. With so many villains watching, this could be his chance to catch their interest. However, before he could think further, Elia suddenly called out to him. She wanted him to be honest. She could already tell. He was weak, wasn't he? Dade hesitated. Elia sighed. Now, she was certain. She admitted that she had intended to beat him senseless but was starting to feel bad about it. Dade, utterly confused, wondered why she was suddenly talking about beating him up. Elia bluntly stated that it was because he stood next to Eleanor earlier, and she absolutely hated her. Not just Eleanor. The entire Tristan family, they were demons. Dade immediately recalled her backstory and the family drama that fueled her hatred. He tried to explain that his encounter with Eleanor was just bad luck, but Elia didn't care that he reminded her of Eleanor, and that was enough of a reason to fight him. Then, She made him a tempting offer. If he wanted, they could fake the fight. Dade immediately realized that this would be his safest option, but if he pretended to fight, he wouldn't gain any skills or learn anything about his new talents. The only way for him to improve was to fight seriously. So he provoked her, claiming that he actually liked Eleanor. Elia froze in disbelief. Her expression darkened, and her grip tightened around her sword. She demanded to know if he was serious. He nodded, claiming he liked Eleanor as much as she hated her. At that moment, mortal charm activated. Every villain in the audience was now interested in him. A new notification appeared, signaling that he had gained another reward. Elia, seething with rage, declared that she would show no mercy. In an instant, she closed the distance and shattered his wooden training sword with a single strike. She acknowledged that at least he wasn't completely useless, since he managed to dodge. With a smirk, she promised to hit harder next time. At that moment, Desperate Survivor activated. His strength skyrocketed to rank A. Without thinking, he punched Elia in the face. She was sent flying, crashing through a wall as the arena fell silent. For a moment, Dade stared in horror. Had he just killed the protagonist on his first day? Sometime later, during a meeting, someone stated that there was a high possibility the boy was a fraud. What he had done made no sense. Everyone knew he had low stats, and his abilities had been checked before the duel, yet his attack had clearly been real and devastating. The woman with the monocle asked what exactly he meant by that, and the scarred man explained that no one in Eland could take a hit like that and walk away unscathed. He suspected the boy had used some sort of illegal enhancement or an unknown technique to defeat Elia. However, there was another strange possibility. Perhaps he was a monstrous genius capable of concealing his true strength. Even so, the woman insisted that accepting this outcome would be difficult, especially since Mangra Kender, the man sponsoring Elia, would not tolerate such a result. Losing Elia and, consequently, losing Mangra's backing would be a major setback for the Academy. They needed to expose the truth about the boy and determine if he was truly a fraud. The man in green asked what exactly they were supposed to do, and she explained that every year, there were noteworthy admissions, and when someone attracted this much attention, it was only a matter of time before they were tested. If the boy really was a fraud, they would soon find out. But if not, things could become far more complicated. At the same time, outside the meeting room, news of the duel had already spread. His face was on the Academy's newspapers, and curiosity about him only grew. Everyone wanted to know who exactly was D. Campbell couldn't believe it. On his first day, he had knocked out the protagonist. He never expected that his talent would make such a massive difference. As he sat in his room, a notification popped up on the system interface. A new profile had been added to his interest list, Eleanor Tristan. Her trust level had increased to level 2, meaning he could collect another reward. At the same time, the curiosity of multiple characters toward him kept increasing. Dade had started figuring out the pattern. First came curiosity, then interest, and finally trust. And each of these levels earned him points he could spend in the system's shop. What he didn't understand was why Eleanor, of all people, seemed the most interested in him. The final boss of the story wasn't supposed to care about him, and yet, her interest outpaced everyone else's. From his latest reward, he received a swordsmanship trait from the Tristan family's combat techniques. However, there was a problem. The Tristan family was infamously connected to demons. Still, for Dade, who only cared about survival, the morality of his skills didn't matter. Something else caught his attention. Elia Christianax had also been added to his profile list. Her curiosity level was already at level 4, meaning she was one step away from giving him a reward. But something about this felt wrong. Elia wasn't a villain. She wasn't even evil. So why was her profile in the system at all? Before he could think further, a loud knock came at his door. A familiar voice called out, "Elia." She asked if this was Dade Campbell's room. His body tensed. His mind raced for a solution. Maybe if he stayed silent, she'd leave. From outside, Elia sighed and knocked again. She said she knew he was inside and that if he didn't answer, she would break down the door. That got his attention. Elia was not joking. Reluctantly, Dade shouted, asking if she was insane. She ignored the question and simply ordered him to open up. She had something important to say. His mind went blank. What could she possibly want? He hesitated, then slowly opened the door. On the other side, Elia stood with a neck brace and bandages covering her face. She looked furious. She told him that maybe, They should get to know each other better. Dade's soul nearly left his body. This was the first time he had hit someone so hard that they actually fell for him. Truly, the world was absurd. A while later, Elia stormed out of his room, grumbling that he was too uptight and should have just accepted. Dade still had no idea what she had even wanted from him. Meanwhile, as she walked through the hallway, Elia's mind was elsewhere. She still didn't understand how to properly interact with men. As she was deep in thought, a small paper bag fell from her hand. She bent down to pick it up, but before she could, another person's hand reached out first. A calm voice told her to be more mindful of where she walked. Elia looked up, and her body froze. Eleanor Tristan stood in front of her. Dressed in her usual regal attire, she looked down at Elia with mild amusement and asked if she was hurt. Elia's eyes widened in shock. In her mind, she saw a distant memory, her older brother's voice telling her to run, the roar of flames, a shadowy figure wielding a sword standing in her way. Elia's hand instinctively reached for her weapon, rage coursing through her veins. But she hesitated. She wasn't sure if she was strong enough to kill Eleanor yet. Meanwhile, Eleanor simply tilted her head and told Elia to get up. Elia found this strange. Eleanor had clearly seen her reach for her weapon, so why wasn't she reacting? Then Eleanor pointed to the bag in Elia's hands and told her to return it. Only then did Elia realize the paper bag belonged to Eleanor. Returning it reluctantly, Elia asked if Eleanor had any connection to Dade. Eleanor told her that if she wanted to find Dade's room, she just needed to go down the hall and take a left. Elia narrowed her eyes. She wasn't an idiot. Why did Eleanor know exactly where his room was? Eleanor, in turn, wanted to know why Elia had been with him in the first place. Elia hesitated. She lied, saying it was just a friendly meeting between new students. Eleanor smirked and shut her down immediately. She stated that new students were forbidden from interacting with the opposite sex. Elia frowned, saying she'd never heard of that rule. Eleanor shrugged, saying she just made it up. From now on, Elia was not allowed to visit his room. Elia didn't care much about that. She was more interested in the way Eleanor had reacted. She wasn't buying it. There was definitely something going on between Dade and Eleanor. And even if it was just for information, Elia knew she had to keep getting closer to Dade. Meanwhile, Dade was heading to the class assignment exams. This test was crucial. Students were ranked and divided into groups. Since Dade had defeated Elia, he had been placed in the strongest group, which was exactly what he wanted to avoid. Everyone in the group was confident and proud, while he looked miserable. But worst of all, Elia refused to leave his side. Since yesterday, he had tried everything to get her to ignore him, but now they were in the same group, making things even worse. Her interest kept increasing, and that was terrifying. At some point, someone had left bread in front of his door, wishing him luck for the exam. He had no idea if it was from her or some other lunatic. Either way, things weren't looking good. At least this exam was part of the original story. So nothing should go too far off track, right? Wrong. The system notification told him otherwise. A special event had been triggered, one that involved Eleanor Tristan. And whenever she was involved, something terrible was bound to happen. Sure enough, Eleanor arrived, saying she was in charge of the exam. Dade's stomach dropped. The professors were eagerly watching, interested in seeing how the student who defeated Elia would perform. Eleanor led them down a dark corridor toward the exam area. One student asked if this was part of the test, but Dade already knew. This wasn't a test. This was a trap. His system card for Eleanor updated, revealing that an assassination attempt was about to occur. His mind raced. The other students were calm, assuming help would arrive soon. But Dade knew the truth. This was the event that gathered all the key characters together for the main storyline. Every single person in this room was important to the final act. And now they were all in danger. Dade had noticed something off about the way the man moved. The assassin, Razum, was confused by Dade's casual attitude, unable to understand why he wasn't afraid. But Dade wasn't worried. He had survivor's desperation activated. Razum decided to strike immediately, wanting to end this quickly before things got complicated. Meanwhile, in the other rooms, chaos had erupted. Students were being slammed into walls, barrages of arrows rained down, and others were being thrown into the air by unseen forces. It was a complete massacre. But that was expected. These were the future heroes of the story. Across the battlefield, Falalha conjured ice magic, freezing the assassins in place while she questioned where Eleanor had gone. Eleanor was handling things in her own way, effortlessly cutting down for enemies and sending their broken bodies crashing into the walls. The assassins didn't even have time to scream before she grabbed one by the collar, demanding to know who sent them. Meanwhile, the mage finished freezing the rest of the enemies, allowing the group to interrogate them properly. After some pressure, they discovered that the attack had been orchestrated by Razum of the Crescent Moon. Eleanor's eyes sharpened at the name, her grip tightening. She wanted to know if Razum was still in the building. The assassin tried to keep his mouth shut, but Eleanor had other methods. With a single stomp to his chest, she cracked several ribs, making it clear that talking was the better option. He finally confessed that Razum was inside the academy, but operating in another area. Elia and the others quickly pieced together the situation. Dade had left on his own, meaning he had intentionally drawn the strongest enemy to himself. Elia demanded to know what Eleanor's relationship with Dade was. Eleanor simply stated that there was none, but then she paused. She admitted that she didn't know him well enough yet. That single sentence caused an eerie silence in the room. Meanwhile, Razum was in trouble. The assassin had set up a flawless barrier, so why was he getting beaten to a pulp? Dade, with his survivor's desperation fully activated, was demolishing him. Not only that, but Dade was also using a sword technique he had copied from Eleanor. He wasn't useless anymore. Razum quickly realized his mistake. He should never have attacked this kid. For the first time, the assassin felt regret. He demanded to know who Dade really was, but Dade ignored him. The charm of death had activated again, and now even the assassin was impressed with his skills. Razum finally gave up. He told Dade to just finish him off. Instead, Dade gave him a message. He told Razum to spread the word. Attacking Eleanor Tristan was off limits. Dade knew what would happen if she kept being targeted. If she activated the Grey Demon's power, things would become uncontrollable. Razum scoffed, asking if Eleanor was really that important. Dade didn't hesitate. He said she was, and that was when he made a mistake. He didn't realize that Eleanor was standing right behind him. She had heard everything. The favorability meter skyrocketed. Notification after notification popped up, increasing her trust level rapidly. Dade turned around in horror. Her interest had jumped at least 15 levels. Somewhere else in the academy, the headmistress was slamming her head on her desk in frustration. Everything was falling apart. She knew the Chancellor was furious and wanted the terrorist group identified immediately, but that was easier said than done. She warned Eleanor to be extremely cautious, since this time they had sent a professional assassin after her. Eleanor, however, didn't seem particularly bothered. The headmistress sighed, saying that all the other survivors from the assassination attempt had been rewarded with honors, except one, Dade Campbell. He had left immediately after the battle, avoiding any recognition. The headmistress was suspicious. Why was he so desperate to avoid attention? Eleanor, deep in thought, muttered that she didn't understand him. She had said that 3 times now. Annoyed, the headmistress threw a book at her, telling her to stop overthinking it. The book hit Eleanor's raised arm, revealing her graceful stance. She apologized, saying she had just been distracted. The headmistress raised an eyebrow. Eleanor never got distracted. Suspicious, she asked what was on her mind. Eleanor hesitated. She said she was interested in someone. The headmistress froze. There was a long, awkward silence. And then, she shouted in disbelief. There was no way Eleanor had fallen for that weird country bumpkin. She warned her. If Archduke Tristan found out, he wouldn't be happy. Eleanor insisted that it wasn't like that. The headmistress sighed in relief. She reminded Eleanor to be careful. Men like that were trouble. Eleanor agreed, saying she would test Dade herself. For now, she would keep a close watch on him. Meanwhile, Dade received his class assignment results. They hadn't been finalized yet. That was a bad sign. It meant the instructors were overthinking his placement. Dade just wanted to be thrown into a random class and be forgotten. Instead, it looked like they were deliberately delaying his assignment. He suspected they were debating whether to place him in the special class, where all the future heroes were. At this rate, he was being excluded, which was just as bad. His first quest had been completed, and a new mission had appeared. He had to resolve an incident that would occur during the freshman reception ceremony. Dade groaned. This was the event where classes were officially assigned. There were the usual divisions: archers, mages, priests, and then the special class. His goal was to use his enhanced strength to get into a class that suited his abilities. The real problem was that Eleanor and Elia were both involved in this event, and that meant something terrible was going to happen. Just as he expected, the system notification confirmed it. A special reward had been unlocked. Since his relationship with Eleanor had deepened, he could now copy one of her abilities. But Dade was smart. He knew this wasn't the right time to use such a precious skill. Eleanor was strong now, but in the future, she would become far more powerful. If he waited, he could steal something even better. That night, Dade escaped the academy. He had hidden himself in an abandoned house, wearing stealth equipment to avoid detection. In the original game, this house was a treasure farming spot. He climbed over the wall, entered the dusty interior, and headed to a pile of stacked items. Among the junk was a single, incredibly valuable artifact, an incense burner that had been sealed for 1,000 years. As he grabbed it, the pile shifted. Something collapsed on top of him. When the dust settled, Dade realized he was holding a girl in his arms. A very familiar girl. The system flashed an urgent warning. He had awakened a hidden boss, Yuria, the cursed sword goddess, and she was not happy. He watched as Yuria hesitated, clearly starving, before snatching the biscuit from the air. She had gone an entire night without food. A moment later, she seemed to regret her decision, but Dud was relieved. At least he wouldn't be killed today. She wanted to know why he was there, but he knew he couldn't tell the truth. Instead, he lied, claiming he had been sent to feed her, saying he had received instructions from someone else to take care of her. She asked if it was someone he knew, and he nodded. Strangely, knowing all the details, he casually reassured her that her sister was safe in the Holy Empire and that the Emperor wouldn't bother the two of them for a while. Therefore, she didn't need to keep hiding like this. Yuria was from the Holy Empire, but she had been forced into hiding at the Elant Academy because of the Emperor's influence. The sword she wielded was considered a cursed artifact, which was why she bore the three-step curse. She had fled her homeland because of this, and Dud wanted to at least offer her some reassurance that her sister was fine. She deserved some peace despite everything she had endured. Meanwhile, atop a mountain, a group of students overlooked the Grand Academy. A blonde girl explained that it was now time for them to choose which faculties they would enroll in. Dud recognized this as the part of the game where players received a vast amount of world-building lore, but since he already knew everything, he could afford to skip through most of it. A red-haired guy pointed toward the distant void on the horizon, asking Ophelia about the strange city under a massive dome. She explained that the area was highly restricted, and anyone who entered would face severe punishment. Dud, however, knew the truth. It was what remained of the war between heaven and hell, the very place where God's messengers and heroes had sealed away the demons. This event had taken place hundreds of thousands of years ago, yet the conflict between light and darkness still persisted, with the obvious risk that the darkness could eventually triumph. The Imperial Alliance had created the Sacred Triangle to keep watch over the area, with multiple elite academies overseeing it, including Elant Academy. Dud watched as Yuria hesitated, clearly starving, before snatching the biscuit from the air. She had gone an entire night without food. A moment later, she seemed to regret her decision, but Dud was relieved. At least he wouldn't be killed today. She wanted to know why he was there, but he knew he couldn't tell the truth. Instead, he lied, claiming he had been sent to feed her, saying he had received instructions from someone else to take care of her. She asked if it was someone he knew, and he nodded. Strangely, knowing all the details, he casually reassured her that her sister was safe in the Holy Empire and that the Emperor wouldn't bother the two of them for a while. Therefore, she didn't need to keep hiding like this. Yuria was from the Holy Empire, but she had been forced into hiding at the Elant Academy because of the Emperor's influence. The sword she wielded was considered a cursed artifact, which was why she bore the three-step curse. She had fled her homeland because of this, and Dud wanted to at least offer her some reassurance that her sister was fine. She deserved some peace despite everything she had endured. Meanwhile, atop a mountain, a group of students overlooked the Grand Academy. A blonde girl explained that it was now time for them to choose which faculties they would enroll in. Dud recognized this as the part of the game where players received a vast amount of world-building lore, but since he already knew everything, he could afford to skip through most of it. A red-haired guy pointed toward the distant void on the horizon, asking Ophelia about the strange city under a massive dome. She explained that the area was highly restricted, and anyone who entered would face severe punishment. Dud, however, knew the truth. It was what remained of the war between heaven and hell, the very place where God's messengers and heroes had sealed away the demons. This event had taken place hundreds of thousands of years ago, yet the conflict between light and darkness still persisted, with the obvious risk that the darkness could eventually triumph. The Imperial Alliance had created the Sacred Triangle to keep watch over the area, with multiple elite academies overseeing it, including Elent Academy. The red-haired student asked Ophelia if they could take a closer look, and she told them that as long as they stayed within the protective barrier of cafes, there would be no danger. Dud, on the other hand, saw this as a perfect opportunity to slip away unnoticed and stir up some trouble. The angels who resided beyond the celestial mountains had helped create this barrier alongside cafes, ensuring its continued stability. The students gathered near the barrier, gazing at it in awe. Meanwhile, Dud asked if he could eat alone, saying he felt uncomfortable in large crowds. Ophelia recognized that he was struggling with all the attention he had been receiving and granted him permission, warning him not to stray too far. Some of the other students didn't like that. They grumbled that the hillbilly was getting arrogant just because of the little bit of fame he had gained. But Dud ignored them. He had already set up his incense burner, infused with unicorn horn powder and a phoenix feather. Where had he gotten those? Who knew? Maybe they had already been inside the burner when he found it. Regardless, it was now the most powerful censer imaginable. As the magical effect took hold, Dud hoped he hadn't forgotten anything important. Suddenly, he sensed multiple presences materializing. He quickly covered his eyes, knowing that what he was about to witness was something most people could only dream of. A blinding explosion of light erupted before him. He heard voices discussing the Allied forces. One of them, a commanding figure, was telling a recruit to smooth out the ground properly instead of digging holes everywhere. When Dud finally opened his eyes, he saw them, angels. They were confused, wondering why a human was there. If an angel appeared now, he would be thrilled. The soldiers questioned why this boy was staring at them so intently while their superior barked at them to get back to work. A horn blared, and a carriage rolled in, carrying what the driver referred to as an infinite supply of sacred blocks, ensuring that construction would continue without interruption. A blonde angel scolded another for slacking off and munching on cloud biscuits instead of working. Meanwhile, Dud watched as the bald angel commanded everyone to resume their duties. He wasn't entirely sure what was going on, but he knew that sacred blocks were being delivered, and he was somehow witnessing it firsthand. Dud had read about how angels in this world were structured almost like a military force, with an incredibly rigid hierarchy where higher-ranked beings held absolute authority. Normally, in the original game, players only encountered angels after Chapter 2, and that was only after interacting with several high-ranking ones. He knew exactly what they wanted, something simple and basic. Stretching, he took a bite of his food and continued eating. As he did, he overheard the angels questioning why he had so much food. One of them suggested that they should ask for some, but another shot the idea down, saying they couldn't descend to the mortal realm just for a meal. It was better to keep working. Dud, on the other hand, casually remarked that construction work must be exhausting. They should take a break and enjoy some good food. Strangely, as soon as he said that, a system notification appeared, activating an offering quest. Instantly, food materialized in the hands of the angels. They smiled, deciding that a 10-minute break wouldn't hurt. They thanked Dud for being so thoughtful, and he recalled that this was how the game worked. If you made the right offering, it could multiply. Just stepping into their world had been enough for them to recognize his goodwill. A while later, the angels were finishing their meal, expressing how delicious it had been and how it had been worth it. The bald one took notice of Dud's censer and asked him what he wanted in return. Dud was impressed by how direct the angel was, skipping all negotiations. He had prepared several strategies to convince the angels to grant him a favor, but it seemed unnecessary. The bald angel explained that he knew Dud must be wondering why he was being treated so kindly. Since Dud was well-informed and possessed an incredible but poorly developed ability, the angel saw the potential benefits of investing in him. That was the only reason they were willing to help. Now Dud understood. This angel was interested in him not out of goodwill but because he saw long-term potential. However, Dud still didn't know what this so-called ability truly was. Maybe it was the one that made him attractive to Eve, pointed toward a certain direction, his voice steady as he warned Elia about 3 monsters quickly approaching. A wolf lunged at them, but in an instant, a single slash split the beast in half. Without skipping a beat, he alerted her to 2 more coming from above. As expected, she reacted swiftly, cutting them down midair. This pattern continued. He called out the threats, and she effortlessly eliminated them. Frustrated, Elia told him to stop giving orders and start fighting himself. However, Dud ignored her completely and instead warned her of 2 daggers being thrown at her from the left and right. In perfect sync with his words, the projectiles came flying, and she managed to deflect them just in time. Another incoming arrow, a beast preparing to strike. Every warning he gave turned out to be accurate, and she countered each one flawlessly. Eventually, she turned to him, irritated, and demanded to know why he wasn't fighting. The truth was simple. Dud's desperate survival ability only activated when his life was truly at risk. Since these were artificial training monsters, they weren't designed to kill students, meaning his skill didn't recognize any real danger. Because of this, his stats remained at their normal, useless level. He realized that if he ever wanted to fight in situations like this, he would need to increase his base stats properly. Suddenly, Elia charged toward him, and for a split second, he panicked, thinking she was about to attack. But instead, she slashed a monster behind him, saving his life. He barely had time to react before confetti rained down from above. They had broken the Academy's dungeon record. Elia seemed surprised. Even though she fought alone, they had still completed the trial faster than any other duo. Dud shrugged, suggesting they were just lucky. But in reality, he had taken the shortest and safest path through the dungeon, allowing them to clear it at record speed. Elia clenched her fists in frustration, slowly realizing that this guy was a complete cheater. Meanwhile, Perse, a top-tier instructor at the Academy, watched the whole event unfold. She commented that the Academy would need to increase the difficulty of these trials next year since they were too easy. However, Professor Conrad, one of the senior instructors, had a different opinion. Everyone assumed Elia had been the key player in the dungeon, but he wasn't convinced. He pointed out that Elia alone couldn't have broken the record. Any experienced warrior could tell that Dud was the real reason they had finished so quickly. Despite appearing weak, his timing was perfect, his choices were optimal, and his strategy was flawless. His movements didn't match those of a normal student. They were too precise, too practiced, as if he had already been through this test before. Conrad then suggested a bet with if Dud and Elia could break this year's overall record, Perse would have to grant them a favor. If they failed, it wouldn't matter, they had already performed well enough to gain recognition. Dud immediately accepted the bet, much to Perse's annoyance. Meanwhile, in another part of the Academy, Ian Norse sat on the floor of her training room, completely exhausted. The Academy director, standing beside her, sighed in frustration. The director reminded Ian that assassins had already tried to kill her 3 times since she arrived at the Academy. The fact that they were now sending high-level assassins meant that things were only going to get worse. But instead of focusing on the danger, Ian was lost in thought. She recalled the legends her mother once told her, the stories of how demonic energy ran through the Tristan bloodline, granting them inhuman power at the cost of their sanity. Snapping out of her thoughts, she casually asked the director about Dud Campbell. The director was stunned for a moment before replying that Dud was currently paired with Elia for an advanced trial. Ian froze, her breath hitching slightly. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and then immediately left the room. Meanwhile, inside the dungeon, Elia questioned Dud's absurd level of confidence. She knew he was skilled, but the way he acted like he knew everything ahead of time was suspicious. Dud simply smiled and told her to trust him. He had a good feeling about this. Unconvinced, Elia narrowed her eyes and asked for a real answer. Dud ignored her and instead requested that the difficulty be increased to the maximum level. At this, Perse completely lost her mind. She warned him that at maximum difficulty, the monsters could actually kill them, meaning the trial would become a real battle to the death. Meanwhile, the green-haired professor, Conrad, observed with intrigue. He suspected that Dud had been hiding his true abilities, and he wanted to confirm his theory. Activating the highest difficulty, Conrad challenged Dud and Elia to prove themselves. Elia was not happy about this. She glared at Dud, but he simply responded that once something starts, there's no turning back. Perse sipped her tea, amused by the whole thing. The instructor controlling the trial announced that execution mode had been activated, and now, for the first time, the monsters would be allowed to kill the students. The moment the monsters turned aggressive, Dud's desperate survival skill activated. With all his stats skyrocketing, Dud drew his sword and instantly decapitated a monstrous rhinoceros-like beast with a single strike. Watching from the sidelines, Conrad smirked, finally confirming his suspicions. He knew it. Dud was deliberately hiding his strength. Meanwhile, Elia fought fiercely, kicking a monstrous creature across the arena with raw strength. But as she battled, she couldn't help but glance at Dud. She had always suspected that he was hiding something, but now she was certain. The stronger their enemies became, the stronger Dud became. Perse, still watching from the control room, couldn't believe what she was seeing. Dud had gone from completely useless to a terrifying powerhouse in an instant, and the more dangerous the situation got, the more unstoppable he became. With one final flurry of sword slashes, Dud and Elia annihilated the final wave of monsters, officially breaking the Academy's all-time record. Just as Dud lowered his sword, a massive shadow loomed behind him, a gigantic insectoid beast preparing to crush him. Before he could react, a massive explosion obliterated the creature, sending debris flying. Standing in the distance, Professor Conrad grinned, casually lowering his glowing staff. He praised them for their performance, officially recognizing their insane abilities. A while later, Elia excitedly showed Dud a piece of paper. As a reward for their victory, they were allowed to choose one powerful artifact from the Academy's vault. In addition, thanks to the bet with Perse, they were also owed a personal favor from her. Still buzzing from the excitement, Elia turned to Dud and asked how he always remained so calm, even in extreme situations. She had noticed that he acted like he already knew the outcome of every battle, as if nothing ever surprised him. Before he could answer, she held out her hand. From now on, she wanted to be his closest ally. Dud hesitated for a moment, then reluctantly shook her hand. On his system screen, her curiosity level had reached level 5. She was now one step away from full trust. As she ran off excitedly, another voice called out from behind him. Turning around, Dud felt his blood run cold. Standing there, arms crossed, was Ian Noor. With a dangerously calm expression, she asked if he liked that freshman girl. For the first time, Dud felt a real sense of danger. Ian Noor stood there, arms crossed, staring at Dud as she repeated her question. Did he like the freshman? At that moment, danger was detected, and his survival instinct kicked in. If he didn't answer properly, his life might actually be in jeopardy. He needed to say something, anything, before this situation got out of control. With a deep breath, he gathered his courage and stated that, yes, he had been training with Elia, but in reality, he had missed Ian Noor. She raised an eyebrow, finding his response abrupt and unexpected. He had no idea if this tactic would work, but there was no way he could fight her and win. His only chance was to appease her. Slowly, Ian Noor smiled, asking if he was trying to say that he had been thinking about her the entire time. He nodded hesitantly, and now she wanted to know why. His mind scrambled for a logical explanation, but he was running out of words. Seeing his hesitation, she casually adjusted her hair, telling him not to worry. She was certain he was feeling this way because of what happened on the train. However, she warned him not to forget his priorities. Dud had no idea what she meant by that, but before he could ask, she handed him a letter, explaining that she had come all this way just to deliver it. As he took it, he wondered if this was some sort of love letter, though deep down he highly doubted it. Ian Noor, looking slightly awkward, admitted she had originally planned to give it to him tomorrow but decided to do it now instead. Turning away gracefully, she instructed him to read it when he was alone. That only made him more suspicious. He was certain this wasn't a confession, but rather a death threat in disguise. Regardless, he accepted it and watched as she disappeared into the distance. The next scene cut to Dud already regretting opening the letter. He never expected this outcome. Ian Noor had written that they should attend the upcoming welcome banquet together as a couple. He wasn't sure if she was doing this to protect him or if she had genuine feelings, but he doubted she was fully in love with him yet. That, however, wasn't even the real issue. The problem was that if he rejected the offer, it wouldn't just change how she treated him, it would lower her affection level, making it harder for him to obtain new skills from her. Before he could process this dilemma, another knock came at the door. He sighed, assuming it was Elia, and opened it, only for her to immediately comment on how he was getting a little too popular lately. She handed him another letter. Dud froze. Another one? Accidentally speaking out loud. He muttered, "Another letter?" and immediately regretted it. Elia narrowed her eyes, demanding to know what he meant by another one. Did he already receive one from someone else? Panicking, he denied it and claimed he misspoke, then quickly asked her what her letter was about. She smirked and told him to think of it as a surprise, something she decided to do after spending time with him. However, she didn't have time to explain further, since there were some weird rules from the student council she had to follow, so she had to leave. Before running off, she instructed him to read it carefully. Now Dud knew exactly what was happening. It was a welcome banquet tradition. Every noble girl at the academy had to invite a boy as their partner. He slowly opened Elia's letter, hoping maybe hers would be different. But no, as expected, it was another invitation. The final boss and the main protagonist were already at war over him, much earlier than the main story dictated. This wasn't supposed to happen. This event never existed in the original timeline, so why was he getting these choices? If he accepted Ian Noor, he would be seen as a villain in the eyes of Elia. If he chose Elia, Ian Noor would hate him, and worst-case scenario, she could succumb to her demonic nature and kill everyone. There was also the third option, rejecting them both, which might be safer but could still backfire in unknown ways. The problem was, they were both still in the interest phase, meaning he still had time before things escalated further. That's when a crazy idea hit him. Why not accept both? The scene transitioned to the grand welcome banquet, where students eagerly gossiped about Class C's delayed arrival. Just as they wondered where they were, the doors opened, revealing Elia gracefully walking in, her presence dominating the room. The lavish hall was filled with nobles, and as she looked around, her eyes met Dud's. Smiling, she thanked him for coming with her. But unknown to everyone, Dud had activated a special skill, Clone Walker, which had cost him 1,000 system points. It was a simple clone, one that could only walk, talk, and hold conversations. He had spent everything on this gamble, and now it was time to see if it worked. According to the system, Dud had been labeled reckless for trying to date both girls at once, but the goal was simple: avoid being discovered until the end of the banquet. As long as no one saw him and his clone together at the same time, he would be fine. As he carefully balanced his movements, an unexpected event began. A caged bear suddenly roared from the sidelines as a group of performers prepared for an extravagant showcase. Dud immediately recognized the scenario. These people were about to make the bear escape, causing chaos. This was his opportunity. Amidst the panic, he could slip away, dismiss the clone, and pretend nothing happened. However, something strange happened. The pheromone ability he had unknowingly activated was beginning to take effect. Just as he prepared to move, Ian Noor appeared, staring straight at him. She inhaled sharply, her expression shifting. Dud felt a cold sweat run down his back. She told him he smelled different, asking if he had used some kind of perfume. Panicking, he quickly lied, saying he had passed by some flowers on the way inside. But Ian Noor wasn't fooled. Something about him was messing with her instincts. As she clenched her fists, trying to regain control of herself, she muttered that he seemed much more masculine than she had originally thought. Dud nearly choked on air. Trying to divert the conversation, he suggested they go grab something to eat, hoping it would break the awkward atmosphere. Ian Noor agreed, though her breathing was noticeably heavier than before. Hoping to lessen her interest, he deliberately picked the greasiest, messiest food possible, wild boar skewers. He assumed that someone as refined as her would be disgusted by it. But instead, she took a bite, her expression lighting up. She loved it. His plan had completely backfired. Trying not to panic, he quickly dragged her toward a vendor stall, hoping to create some distance between her and Elia's clone. The stall sold accessories, and Ian Noor asked if he wanted anything. Dud declined, but offered to buy something for her. That was a mistake. He already knew that doing anything thoughtful for her would increase her affection level, but he did it anyway. And to make matters worse, he accidentally chose the worst possible gift, a uniform button. Holding it up, he awkwardly asked if she wanted it. Instead of being disappointed, Ian Noor smirked, stating that it was impressive that he had paid enough attention to notice that a button was missing from her uniform. Dud mentally screamed in frustration. Sometime later, as they sat together at a small table, Ian Noor casually asked if he had decided what to study at the academy. He replied that he planned to focus on theology. Ian Noor raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. She told him he was wasting his talent, stating that he should become a knight instead. But Dud insisted he had his reasons. Ian Noor leaned forward, demanding to know what those reasons were. Dud simply smiled, keeping his true intentions hidden. He wasn't trying to protect others. He was trying to survive. Stated clearly that he was referring to the curse that caused every Tristan to eventually lose their sanity, and he was certain that the only way to prevent it was through mental training. Ian Noor's expression darkened as she demanded to know if he truly believed he had a solution. Before she could get too worked up, he interrupted, saying that he knew about the blessing of the archangels, a divine miracle where two archangels had to bestow their blessings upon the same individual. Ian Nor confirmed it was true, but also pointed out that it was such an impossible feat that even the Tristan family, with all their power, had never been able to achieve it, which was why they were still feared. She once again pressed him, asking what his true intentions were and why he continued to get closer to her despite knowing something so dangerous. Dud, with an almost reckless sincerity, told her the truth. The thing he wanted to protect was her. Ian Nor, visibly taken aback, tried to brush off her reaction, asking why he was doing this. Dud simply stated that if he didn't protect her, she would die. That was the reality, and he had no further reason beyond that. For the first time, Ian Nor faltered. Brushing her hair behind her ear, she quietly admitted that she had always known he was a strange man. Dud merely smiled, remarking that he had been told that many times before. With that, he had said everything, and he could only hope it was enough to satisfy her curiosity. The scene then shifted to another part of the banquet, where Elia was walking alongside Dud's clone, finding his behavior unusually quiet. She remarked that he was acting strange, wondering why he wasn't talking as much as usual. Glancing around the dimly lit underground hall, she questioned why they had even ended up in this part of the banquet. As she peered over her shoulder, her thoughts drifted back to her true goal, to learn more about the Tristan family. The problem was that she had no experience dealing with men like Dud. Her lack of understanding in these situations was driving her insane. More concerning, she suddenly realized something. This area was filled with caged monsters. Still thinking aloud, she assumed they were experimental creatures belonging to the academy, but she also noted how irresponsible it was for the professors to leave them in an area where students were roaming freely. As she turned to comment further, she noticed that one of the cages had a blinking red light. The containment lock had been tampered with. Before she could react, an explosion erupted from the cage. The clone lunged forward, shielding Elia from the blast. At that same moment, Dud's real body, alongside Ian Nor and the other nobles, flinched as the deafening noise shook the banquet hall. Back underground, the impact had knocked Dud's clone to the ground, and Elia, disoriented but unharmed, processed what had just happened. She turned toward him, shaken, and for the first time, her favorability level skyrocketed. Meanwhile, Dud's real self, feeling the connection with the now damaged clone, immediately dismissed it, rushing toward the chaos. Ian Nor, gasping for breath, demanded to know where he was going. He shouted back that he was going to protect the students. Ian Nor, still feeling strangely overwhelmed, could only watch as he vanished into the wreckage of the banquet hall. Now fully engaged in battle, Dud surveyed the situation. The escaped monsters were all high-level creatures, and students were already struggling to contain them. His mission objective updated, he had to save as many students as possible. Elsewhere, students on the first floor found themselves cornered by the largest of the escaped creatures. A group of terrified students stood frozen as the beast's eyes glowed red, signaling its aggression. One student managed to raise a barrier, but it was already cracking, and they desperately called for a professor's help. Ian Nor, having caught up, assessed the situation. Neither Chancellor Conrad nor any other high-level professor was present. Worse, she couldn't activate the blessing of the angels, meaning the best they could do was stall for time until reinforcements arrived. She turned to the Academy's head priest, demanding he use sacred magic to reinforce the barrier. The priest, looking pale and hesitant, admitted that it was impossible. Casting a high-level sacred barrier required years of experience. He instead suggested they wait, believing that if only a few students died, it would be an acceptable loss. He further commented that if she truly wanted to help, she should just use the Tristan family's powers, though he made it clear that he didn't trust them. Before Ian Nor could respond, a figure burst through the corridor, moving at high speed. Dud. Charging forward with reckless abandon, he shouted for everyone to get back. The students gawked in disbelief. Who was this insane person running straight at the monster? Ian Nor, despite herself, felt awe as she watched him advance without hesitation. As soon as the beast launched its attack, Dud activated two of his abilities simultaneously, Asceticism and Sacred Shield. At the exact moment the danger was detected, his stats were instantly pushed to rank X. The priest, still maintaining the failing barrier, screamed, demanding to know what Dud was thinking. Dud only had one answer. He was going to stall for time while the other students escaped. With asceticism activated, all of Dud's stats converted into defense, making him immune to most damage. He raised his sacred barrier just as the monster's massive claw came crashing down. The attack landed, but Dud held his ground. The nearby professors, who had been watching helplessly, gasped in recognition. That was a true sacred blessing. The monster, frustrated, roared and continued to relentlessly attack the barrier, but Dud refused to let it break. Ian Nor stood still, frozen. For the first time in her entire life, she didn't know how to react. From the sidelines, the priest, who had doubted Dud's ability, finally understood. This wasn't just a basic sacred blessing. This was something beyond that. Before anyone could process the significance, a loud crack filled the air. Someone had just struck the priest from behind. It was Elia. "Took me long enough, huh?" she said, dusting off her hands. Ian Nor, still stunned by everything, snapped her attention to Elia, demanding to know where she had been. Elia casually explained that she had been handling the escaped creatures underground, but unfortunately, one had slipped past her. However, she was far more interested in Dud. How was he using a blessing of this level? She stated that normally, achieving this kind of power required 10 years of training as a combat priest. Ian Nor's eyes widened. Those exact words triggered a memory. Dud had told her that he had something to learn from the Department of Theology. She thought back to his words. If he didn't protect her, she would die. Something in her expression softened. For the first time, her gaze toward him was no longer sharp and guarded. It was softer, more vulnerable. Meanwhile, Elia smirked, remarking that Ian Nor was truly lucky. Confused, Ian Nor demanded to know what she meant. Elia smiled, her eyes flickering with amusement as she pointed toward Dud. "He's doing all of this for you." At that moment, Ian Nor froze. A flood of emotions she couldn't recognize washed over her. The monster roared again, striking Dud's barrier with all its might, but before it could land another blow, Ian Nor stepped forward, gripping her sword tightly. She wasn't going to stand by and watch anymore. The Academy's experiments with live monsters were openly supported by the Tristan family, and with Ian Nor involved, it only solidified that this entire mess somehow traced back to her lineage. Normally, she avoided political entanglements, so why had she decided to step in at this moment? While the remaining students fled in panic, Ian Nor stood completely still, gazing at the battlefield with an unreadable expression. With a sigh, she muttered that it was finally over, but before she could even relax, a charred, grotesquely twisted monster suddenly rose from the flames. Dud teleported instantly, placing himself between her and the creature. The beast, now nothing more than a skeletal abomination, lunged at him, grabbing onto his exhausted body. Dud had already pushed himself to the limit, and after taking the full brunt of the attack, his vision faded into darkness. Sometime later, he awoke in a bed, immediately asking about the monsters. A woman in monocles was sitting beside him, calmly flipping through a book. Without even looking up, she told him to relax, assuring him that the creature had been eliminated and that Ian Nor was safe. This was Chancellor Atalanta. Closing her book, she finally looked at him and smirked, asking if he was surprised that she had come to visit him. She explained that she had simply been waiting for the perfect opportunity. After all, she hadn't found a good moment to approach him since the duel between the freshmen. Dud knew exactly who this woman was, an immortal who had lived for thousands of years. So why had she come here? Was it to question him about the angel's blessing? Instead, Atalanta casually mentioned that she had both bad news and even worse news. Dud, already bracing himself, asked for the bad news first, preferring to save the worst for last. Atalanta leaned back in her chair, stating that he was now receiving more attention than any student in Academy history. Every major incident somehow had him at its center, and based on her experience, things were only going to get worse for him. The worst news was that she now needed to know how much he understood about the future of the demon race. Dud didn't react much, simply stating that it was interesting she would bring up such a topic while acting as if his lack of reaction was completely normal. Atalanta found his response amusing but pressed further, asking what exactly he knew. Dud, unwilling to reveal too much, stated that he wouldn't share anything until he understood what she was planning. Atalanta laughed, feigning innocence, asking what he could possibly mean by that. Dud pointed out that, despite everything that had happened, he still hadn't been placed into a class, an odd oversight for someone who had caused so much chaos. Instead of answering directly, Atalanta leaned closer, stating that she knew he must be frustrated with the situation. However, due to the commotion he had caused, she was personally overseeing his placement. She warned him that, at the moment, the balance of power was far more unstable than it appeared. The three ruling factions that controlled the Academy Alliance were not as peaceful as they seemed. Beneath the facade of stability, a ruthless battle for dominance was playing out, with each faction doing whatever it took to secure the strongest individuals. But acknowledged that he was aware of this conflict. After all, these three factions were the ones that surrounded the remnants of the ancient war between heaven and hell. Atalanta smirked again, confirming that he was correct. The so-called peaceful relations between the three were a lie. Beneath the surface, every side was engaging in brutal power plays to ensure they would be the ones to claim dominance. Most students were completely oblivious to this. However, the constant string of random incidents was a direct result of this ongoing power struggle. Dud narrowed his eyes, realizing that, despite everything, none of these incidents had spread outside the academy. That meant someone was deliberately suppressing information. Atalanta, now genuinely impressed, nodded in agreement. Dud, putting the pieces together, figured out what she was worried about. She was afraid someone might try to kidnap him and use him for their own gain. He asked her directly if that was what she feared most. Atalanta sighed, admitting that he was right. If he were captured, the world would be doomed. For a brief moment, Dud's vision blurred, and he saw an illusion, a world in ruins, devoured by flames. Shaking off the strange vision, he turned his attention back to Atalanta, who casually presented him with a document. He immediately recognized the symbol on the paper, the seal of the purifiers. Atalanta chuckled, impressed that he already knew about them. The purifiers were a secret cult dedicated to demon worship, operating from the shadows. Their only purpose was to bring demons back from hell and plunge the world into ruin. It was now confirmed that both the assassination attempts on Ian and the recent academy attacks were orchestrated by them. They were actively targeting the Tristan family, and there was no reason to believe they would stop anytime soon. Dud, now fully alert, wanted to know why she was telling him all of this. Atalanta merely smiled, stating that she couldn't reveal that just yet. However, she handed him an object, a dimensional key. This was a ridiculously broken artifact, capable of opening doors between worlds. Dud instantly understood its value, and Atalanta confirmed that he already knew what it was for. She told him to use it wisely. If he proved himself, she might even grant him more rewards in the future. However, she warned him that this conversation had to remain a secret. Finally, before leaving, she asked how his relationships with the Tristan heir and the hero candidate were going. Dud froze. How did she know about that? Still, he hesitantly replied that everything was fine. Atalanta smiled mischievously, stating that he needed to keep it that way. Now even more paranoid, Dud demanded to know why that was important. Atalanta simply waved him off, stating that if he failed to maintain those relationships, the world would end. Dud, feeling a growing sense of dread, demanded an explanation. Why did everything lead to the destruction of the world? Atalanta refused to elaborate, only saying that he was already involved, and it was his fault. A few moments later, she left the room, leaving Dud staring at the dimensional key, lost in thought. The fact that he had received this artifact so early in the game was a clear sign that something was deeply wrong. Before he could dwell on it for long, Professor Conrad entered the room, stating that he had finally found him. Dud immediately hid the key, asking why Conrad was looking for him. Conrad grinned, explaining that while Dud still lacked a class, that didn't mean he was exempt from attending lectures. Handing him an enrollment document, Conrad smirked, stating that starting tomorrow, he would begin his lessons alongside Ian, Noor, and Elia. Dud's expression twisted in horror. All he could think was the end of the world was coming faster than expected. Dud was confused as to why the system seemed so eager for him to turn good people into bad ones. Sometime later, deep within a forest, it was time for survival training. Conrad stood before the students, explaining that the test was simple. They had 10 minutes to bring back something that they believed would impress him. Someone asked how points would be awarded, but Conrad simply shrugged, telling them that they would have to figure it out themselves. Ian Noor, as class president, would assist him in judging the scores. He wished them all good luck before sending them off. The students were frustrated. This test was way too vague. Meanwhile, Elia was seething, already irritated at the thought of having Ian Noor as her judge. Dud checked the system screen, still trying to figure out how to turn good people into villains. Elia suddenly approached him, looking confident. She asked if he wanted to work together. Dud politely declined, suggesting she stick with her usual friends. However, Elia frowned, stating that he was her friend too. What Dud was really thinking was that she needed to stick with the protagonist group, the ones who would eventually defeat the Demon King. The other hero candidates had been watching quietly, seemingly waiting for her decision. Completely unfazed, extended the offer again. She asked him to join their team. But Dud refused once more, knowing that in their group, he would become just another background character. Still, Elia wasn't giving up. She tilted her head, confused, genuinely curious as to why he was being so distant. Dud casually said it was nothing, it was just that they weren't that close. Elia froze in place, her expression falling for the first time. Then, without another word, she turned away, forcing a weak smile as she said, "That's a shame, but okay." Even the nun, Trisha, overheard the exchange and looked devastated. Dud, suddenly feeling a pang of guilt, wondered if he had been too harsh, but at the same time, he knew that keeping his distance was necessary. Just then, a tall blonde boy approached him, calling out his name. Dud immediately recognized him, Talion Armandi, the second strongest student after Elia. Talion stood with a hand on his chin, scrutinizing Dud carefully. He wanted to know what exactly Dud's relationship was with the hero candidate. Dud, keeping his face neutral, simply replied that they had just met recently, and that was all. Talion, however, didn't seem convinced. He coldly stated that someone like Elia shouldn't have any connection to a nobody like him. At that moment, the rule of evil activated. The system confirmed that a good individual was growing furious due to Dud's influence. Talion continued pressing the issue, bringing up the duel results and calling Dud suspicious. Dud, however, was actually pleased. He was finally starting to understand how to corrupt good people. Talion then challenged him. He demanded that Dud admit his victory against Elia had been a fraud. Dud, knowing that this guy was destined to become a mini-boss, realized that Talion was the perfect target for his ability. With a calm smile, he approached him and spoke bluntly, stating that his win had been real. But clearly, Talion couldn't accept it. Seeing his goal crushed in a single blow must have shaken him. Elia had been standing nearby, quietly listening, her expression tense as she clenched her fists. Talion's frustration reached its peak. He then challenged Dud to a bet. He suggested they see who could earn a higher score on today's survival test. Dud grinned internally. This was perfect. Meanwhile, Conrad was addressing Ian Noor, calling her out for not taking her role seriously. He pointed out that Dud hadn't even participated in the test, but had already received a perfect score. Ian Noor simply shrugged, stating that he deserved it. Conrad sighed, saying that if she kept playing favorites, she would no longer be allowed to participate in grading. Ian Noor, completely unfazed, responded that the only reason she was being strict was because she didn't want Dud to be left alone with Elia. However, Conrad sternly reminded her that if she didn't act professionally, she would be barred from this event altogether. Elsewhere, Trisha was clutching her rosary, deep in thought. She had noticed a change in Elia's behavior. There was something off about her today. Elia was fighting fiercely, kicking monsters with precise brutality, while the red-haired axe wielder asked where they could find stronger beasts. Talion suggested they collect gems instead, while the mage agreed, saying that this was their best option for now. However, in the middle of the battle, a strange purple sigil suddenly appeared in Elia's chest. Her expression shifted slightly. Trisha, possessing a unique ability to sense emotions, could tell that, despite her calm face, Elia was feeling angry. Concerned, Trisha approached her, gently asking if she was okay. Elia, turning her head slightly, forced a small smile and claimed that she was fine. Trisha pressed further, offering to listen if there was anything wrong. Elia, however, immediately shut her down, stating that nothing was wrong. Trisha sighed, sitting down beside her, saying that it was obvious something was bothering her. Elia hesitated for a moment, then finally admitted the truth. She was frustrated. No matter what she did, Dud kept maintaining his distance, even after everything they had gone through together. Trisha nodded, saying that perhaps Dud wasn't doing it out of malice. Maybe he was trying to protect her reputation. Elia was visibly surprised, asking if Trisha really believed that. Trisha smiled, stating that yes, she truly believed that Dud considered her a close friend. Dud, completely unaware of any of this, was currently running through the forest. His stamina was running low, and his ability was reaching its limit. At that moment, the system notified him that he had successfully influenced another individual. Talion was now chasing him in a blind rage. Dud even received a special command option thanks to Talion's sheer hatred. Talion, roaring, vowed to kill him and roast him over a fire. He hurled a spear with deadly precision, and Dud barely dodged in time. Before Talion could launch another attack, A flash of silver steel sliced his spear in half. Both boys froze. Elia had arrived, her sword glowing with raw power. Her eyes were filled with determination as she coldly ordered Talion to back away from her friend. Dud, still catching his breath, stared at her in shock. Talion was also confused. This was the first time he had seen her since their duel. Elia, however, stepped forward, placing her blade against his neck, stating that he had lost. He was wrong. Talion, now completely outmatched, dropped to his knees, stammering an apology. Elia, satisfied, sheathed her sword, stating that they could get along if he knew his place. As she walked away, Dud was completely bewildered. He had no idea what just happened. However, there was no time to dwell on it. It was time to return and claim his final score. First, he had to get his score, but Trisha was already suspicious of Elia's behavior. Normally, Elia would have tried to reason with Talion first, but this time, she drew her sword without hesitation. At that moment, Trisha saw Dud as the real problem, and Dud, as always, was in trouble. When he arrived to speak with Conrad, there had clearly been a major fight. The instructor had barely managed to stop the president from hunting him down. She had apparently insisted that Dud had to be punished no matter what, and Conrad had jokingly said she could, if she beat him first. The result? She was now lying flat on the ground, exhausted. Conrad sighed, telling her to get up already. She was improving, and soon, she might actually surpass him. Dud ignored all of this, simply stating that he was there to receive his score and leave. Conrad, seemingly having forgotten about the test in the middle of the chaos, finally remembered and asked what Dud had brought. Dud apologized for the delay, then opened his bag, revealing a collection of rare, high-quality gems. Conrad nodded in approval, announcing that Dud was in first place. Perse, of course, would love everything he had collected. Now that the mission was complete, Dud knew it was time to speak with Ian Noor. She was definitely getting angry. But before he could do so, Trisha appeared. She wanted to confirm whether he had finished the test. As the professor left, Trisha suddenly yelled at Dud, telling him to take care of Elia, but at the same time not to get too close to her. She pointed out that every time Elia was around him, she acted strangely. That didn't make any sense, but Dud just sighed, gave a casual wave, and walked away, saying he'd do his best. Trisha watched him leave, still concerned. If he didn't handle things properly, he might not make it out alive. As she tended to Ian North's wounds, she thought to herself that, even though Elia seemed calm, no one should ever push her past the limit. Later, in the magic department, Perse asked if Dud was finally going to use his wish. He confirmed that he had come to request something from the goddess of magic. Perse rolled her eyes, telling him to stop bothering her. She was already busy. He replied that it wasn't anything complicated, but Perse wasn't buying it. She muttered that if he didn't use this ridiculous wish, no one would have to do anything at all. Dud noticed that everyone in the department was staring at them, but unfortunately, he had no choice. He needed to prepare for the upcoming fight. Perse sighed, stating that since she had made a promise, she would honor it. She asked what he wanted. Dud swallowed hard. One of the rewards he had received from Elia for reaching 500 points was a corrupt seed. This could be exchanged for special abilities in the system shop. At that moment, he had negative affinity with Elia, meaning he could force her to comply once using the rule of evil. The same applied to Talion. The abilities he had been acquiring would be perfect for his upcoming battle, but right now, he was too weak to win against what was coming. However, he knew how to fix that. He looked Perse in the eyes and told her, "I need a cannon strong enough to destroy the entire academy." Perse blinked, then immediately snapped at him, demanding to know if he had lost his mind. Dud repeated himself, his expression unwavering. Perse stared at him for a moment, then laughed in disbelief. She told him that building a cannon like that wasn't difficult. The problem was, why did he need something that extreme? Dud cut her off, pointing out that in the contract, it was stated that she had to grant any reasonable wish. A cannon was a normal weapon, therefore she was obligated to make it. Perse crossed her arms, stating that a weapon capable of blowing up the entire academy was far from normal. Dud calmly assured her that he had no intention of harming anyone. There was simply a problem that needed to be solved before it got out of control. That only made Perse more suspicious, but she finally relented, stating that she would trust him this time. She then mumbled to herself that it was insane how the Chancellor was placing so much faith in Dud. She even joked that, at this rate, the entire academy would be his personal harem. Dud raised an eyebrow, asking what she meant by that. Perse's face immediately turned red. She had accidentally said that out loud instead of thinking it. She quickly changed the subject, asking if he had any other requests. Dud nodded, remembering that he could choose one item from the Vision Warehouse, his reward for breaking the Academy record. Sometime later, as he walked down the hallway, Dud reflected that, now that he had secured the cannon, he still needed the right materials. Thanks to the interdimensional key, that might not be too difficult. Suddenly, a man with a cane called out to him. Dud turned, his instincts immediately on alert. The man's face seemed familiar. Hadn't he been in one of those blood-stained photos? This was definitely the next major villain. The man smiled, introducing himself as Galder Riverbeck. He claimed to operate a charity center known as the House of Purification. Dud, however, internally scoffed. He knew that was a complete lie. This man was the true leader of this chapter, the Furious Fire King. Galder chuckled, stating that he had heard quite a bit about Dud. The boy who had slain monsters and stood beside Ian Noor, that wasn't something an ordinary student could do. He handed Dud a card, saying that whenever he encountered extraordinary talent, he liked to see their potential firsthand. He then invited Dud to dinner. Dud grimaced internally, great, another person asking him out. He was already drowning in attention from women, and now some old man wanted a private meal, disgusting. However, Dud knew how to play the game. Instead of outright refusing, he smiled politely, stating that this conversation was enough for now. But internally, he was worried. This guy was supposed to approach Elia and her brother, not him. Why was everything shifting toward him? Had the system recognized him as the new protagonist? That didn't make any sense. Still, he told Galder that he would consider his invitation. As the villain left, he muttered that they would meet again in 3 days at Twilight's Eye, a luxurious restaurant near the academy. Dud sighed. He had no choice but to attend. Skipping a main event in the story meant death. As he considered his next move, he knocked on a door. The person inside asked who it was. Ian Noor. For once, she wasn't wearing her uniform. She asked why he had come. Dud, slightly nervous, hesitated before asking if she would be free for dinner in 3 days. Ian Noor paused, but before she could answer, the monocle girl behind her interrupted, scolding her for hoarding books instead of returning them. Annoyed, Ian Noor shut her up. She then asked Dud, "Is it just the two of us?" He nodded. She asked where he planned to take her. Twilight's Eye, he said. The monocle girl gasped. That was a date spot. Ian Noor, completely unfazed, simply said, "I know." He wanted to experience the world and maybe, just maybe, earn the title of guardian. However, his sister scoffed, telling him to stop dreaming. Someone who constantly bullied his little sister could never become a guardian. He laughed, telling her that life was full of mysteries and you could never predict the future. She crossed her arms, clearly annoyed, and then asked the obvious question. Wasn't he going to die the moment he went to the battlefield? He shrugged, saying that it would only happen if he was unlucky, but he was far too skilled for that to happen. Glaring at him, she muttered that she hoped he got unlucky and died, since he was always picking on her, ignoring their parents, and swinging that stupid sword around all day. He simply laughed again, telling her to remember this moment, because when he became a guardian, he would always be there to protect her. Back in the present, she woke up to the sound of someone knocking on her door. When she opened it, Dud was standing there, looking a little guilty. He apologized, explaining that since he was from the countryside, he wasn't really used to how things worked around here. That whole thing about them not being friends, a lie. He wanted to apologize properly. To make up for it, he had even bought some cookies from the kitchen. They were delicious. She snatched them from his hand, telling him to stop apologizing because it was weird. They were already friends. Then she turned away, saying she was going to bed. But before she could leave, Dud suddenly spoke up again. He had a favor to ask. He wanted her to come with him somewhere. It was urgent. Elia looked at him like he was insane. Meanwhile, Ian Noor was signing some documents, as elegant as ever. It seemed they were reviewing the costs of materials and club funding. The monocle girl beside her commented that the only thing left was to check on the recent transfer students. One of them, apparently, was from the Tribal Alliance. She had lost her position and was now considered an exile. Her name was Lilu Garuda, and judging by that brutal knee strike, it was obvious she was the same girl with the thigh tattoo. Terrifying. Ian Noor simply muttered that she might have heard of her before. Additionally, in the next semester, a true saint from the Holy Empire was transferring to the academy. Ian Noor raised an eyebrow. Was she coming alone? The monocle girl shook her head, obviously not. She would be bringing an entourage. Ian Noor leaned back in her chair, deep in thought. A saint from the Holy Empire and the daughter of a major tribal leader arriving at nearly the same time. That was suspicious. She slammed her fist on the desk, certain that someone was pulling the strings behind the scenes. Her friend sighed, saying that this academy was always a mess anyway. Ian nor exhaled sharply, rubbing her temples. Sometimes, she forgot how chaotic things could be. She apologized, admitting that she had been a little stressed lately, but that she would calm down soon. Under the moonlight, Dud lay flat on his back, staring up at the sky. He had no idea that the academy had an observation deck. The night sky was breathtaking. Elia, sitting beside him, sighed. "Do we really need to be doing this right now?" she asked. Dud simply told her to be patient. It was about to happen. They were on top of a catapult. Elia was horrified. He assured her that even though the target destination was a restricted area, it was only meant for high-level users, but thanks to the card he had received from the Chancellor, they had access. Then he smirked. "Here we go." And with that, the catapult fired. As they soared through the air, he reminded her to stay focused and keep her eyes open. For a brief moment, she remembered her brother. He used to say the exact same thing. Then they hit a portal midair, activating the interdimensional key. Dud had warned her that this might be a little dangerous. In the blink of an eye, they vanished.